what happens on a pure carnivore diet
Mhm.
is that insulin is not triggered. And insulin is a very misunderstood hormone. Insulin is not responsible. Insulin is not responsible in a healthy person for the regulation of blood sugar. Glucagon is.
Mm.
So if you're not eating carbohydrates in your body, all of your sugar has to come from glucagon, not from insulin.
Mhm.
Yes, insulin facilitates the entry into certain cells, not all cells, like your muscle cells, but at a very, very low level.
Mhm.
But glucagon is the dominant hormone that regulates how much sugar there is in your body.
Mhm.
And insulin is really just there in a small amount. And one of the things that I've discovered, and Ben Bittman has done the same thing in the laboratory, is that we believed, and my friend Tim Noakes taught me this, is that as your blood sugar rises, the sugar triggers the release of insulin. So even if you eat meat and glucagon releases sugar into your liver, you should see a rise in insulin, and that's false. You don't.
Mhm.
The primary trigger, and it's conceptually understandable, the primary trigger of insulin, yes, blood sugar triggers at a slight amount. If you remember the old penny farthing bicycle, it had the little wheel on the back and the big wheel on the
Mhm.
front. That's kind of how insulin release works, where elevations in blood sugar will cause a minor rise in insulin, but inadequate. Whereas if you think about it, why should insulin be released? It should be released when we eat. And if we have some carbohydrate in our diet, there are hormones in the gut, particularly a hormone that everybody knows called GLP-1 right now.
Mhm.
GLP-1 is a hormone that gets released by the upper gut that primarily does two things. It triggers insulin release and it shuts down glucagon, which is kind of what you want.
Mhm.
So because insulin is there, it's an anabolic hormone together with thyroid, testosterone, and human growth hormone that results in the storage, the manipulation, the rebuilding, and the storage of product. Nobody absorbs food into their bloodstream. We absorb amino acids, we absorb glucose, we absorb mono elements of everything. Whether it's the lipids, whether it's the amino acids, whether it's the sugars, the gut breaks it down. And under the influence of insulin, we rebuild and store that. We're in the fat cells, we turning sugar into fat, de novo lipogenesis, same thing in the liver. But in order to release insulin, we need to trigger GLP-1. And fat and protein does not trigger GLP-1. We know that. So we get a non-insulin response. And the issue with insulin is that insulin is there for protein synthesis. Insulin regulates cholesterol synthesis. Insulin regulates steroid hormone synthesis. Insulin regulates cell replication, especially at the mitochondrial level. So through receptors, surface receptors. So insulin is a primary quarterback regulatory hormone. And when we test our pure carnivores, our lean mass hyperresponder carnivores, they behave almost like a type 1 diabetic. When you give them a load of carbohydrate, they're so unfamiliar with it that their insulin curve is flat and their sugar curve goes up and stays up for a very, very long time. And we call that insulin suppression, which is fine. I don't have a problem with the glucose management because you're not eating it. But the problem is that you don't have insulin adequately available once or twice a day in that diurnal pattern to perform all of its other functions. And how do we know that's happening? Because when we do blood work, we start to see triglycerides go up. Well, triglycerides are exclusively produced by the liver when it's converting excess sugar to fat. That's why your triglyceride level is such an important monitor for me of blood sugar. It's not a cause, but it's a marker of elevated blood sugar. And if you're not eating carbohydrates, for the most people have high triglycerides, it comes from chronic excessive carbohydrate consumption. And the first step of protection is the liver turning that into fat. So your VLDL goes up, and then the liver is shipping that fat to the fat cells for storage. So traffic is liver to fat cells instead of fat cells back to liver for ketogenesis under the influence of glucagon. And then what happens is that you eat a lot of protein, and the excess protein, nobody knows how much. Nobody can tell me how much. Okay? It's always excess, and it should be slightly excessive on a carnivore diet because you want some of that sugar. But now, if you're eating it excessively, that extra sugar is having to be turned into triglycerides. and the sugar is spilled over into the bloodstream, and we see a slight rise in sugar. So my good friend Paul Mason says that your A1C goes up because red cells are healthier and they live longer. That may be true, but why are your triglycerides going up? Why is your A1C going up? Why are all the glycemic markers going up? And that's because of lack of insulin. Mm-hmm. And under those circumstances, we need to trigger the question then is that healthy or unhealthy? Mm-hmm. Dave Feldman has shown that those elevated lipids don't affect the bloodstream. Mm-hmm. But the question that we have, and Ben Bickman has done the same thing with cells, is it important to have that fluctuation in insulin? Or is it okay to have a flat line of insulin? And given the other causes of it, you can go to, I know it's not the great source, but if anybody just goes to Wikipedia and looks at functions of insulin, there's over 100 functions of insulin that don't involve sugar. Okay, it's a regulatory hormone. And so what happens with those other functions over time? What happens to our aging? What happens in our brain? So we use certain products to trigger an insulin release once or twice a day. So my son, who's 3 years old, he's a little guy. He's been a carnivore since before he was a sperm and an egg, okay? In other words, my wife and I were carnivore at conception, and he's been that throughout. And I'd say 95% carnivore because he eats a little bit the few things that we do. However, he gets a bottle of raw milk or whole milk with heavy cream twice a day. Why? Because milk has glucose and galactose in it, no fructose. And it isn't there. It's got a lot of, in fact, milk is the only carnivore product that is dominant in saturated fat. All the others are actually dominant in polyunsaturated fat, which most people don't understand. But that milk, that little bit of glucose and galactose, triggers enough of an insulin response that he's getting that insulin for his growth twice a day. And, when we measure this, he was at his pediatrician. I'll just tell an anecdote because I know I'm narrativing a lot. I'm talking a lot here. He was at the pediatrician's office a little while ago for a preschool well check. And this kid is robust. He looks a bit like you. He's got a lot of muscles. He's blonde, but he's got a lot of muscles. Just beautiful to see. And it's strong. Be that as it may, he was at the pediatrician. They did a urine check on him. And he came back 3+ ketones, and they hit the panic button. Mm-hmm. He's got diabetes. He's a type 1 diabetic. And my wife just smiled at him. And he came back, and in US numbers, they then did a blood stick on him, and they checked his blood sugar. And his blood glucose was 92. Now, 92 in the US is absolutely fine. I want that to be under 95 in the morning. But when my wife told me about this, I said, oh, my goodness, that's high. Why is his blood sugar so high? 92 is high for him. And the reason was about an hour before, he had his bottle of milk. Mm-hmm. So, 92 was his high. He normally lives in the 60s and 70s for his blood sugar, but he's always in ketosis. Mm-hmm. But we give him that milk for that diurnal rise. And in some of my insulin suppressed patients, we've seen over the course of several months that they've been able to correct that by introducing a small amount of some form of carbohydrate into their diet. And that, again, follows very similarly to Isabella's patients who typically do eat some carbohydrate. And she, in that study, has demonstrated their blood work is about as healthy as possible because they're triggering insulin. Mm-hmm. I'm not and I'll throw this out there, I'm absolutely in my space, not a fan of Paul Saladino, who promotes a lot of carbohydrate, okay? Because Paul's out he's surfing all day long. I mean, he's out there surfing. He's utilizing that carbohydrate. He's way over the top on that. But there are a few times in some of our athletes who are pure carnivores where the benefit of a little bit of carbohydrate to trigger insulin is a value. Now, the flip side of that, so one last anecdote, there's a guy called Ian Lake. I don't know if you know who Ian Lake is. No, I don't think so. If you haven't had Ian Lake on, you definitely need to. Ian Lake is a GP in the UK. Wonderful guy, brilliant guy. And Ian Lake is an ultra distance athlete, okay? So a marathon for him is a training run. And he's also a lifelong type 1 diabetic. And just a brilliant man. I've known Ian for a long time. Just a great guy, very humble man. But Ian did something called the 0-5-100. And 0-5-100, what does that mean? Because diabetics have to eat carbohydrates and they have to snack on carbohydrates, and you have to have 75 grams. And he's been carnivore for a very long time. Okay. Now, he doesn't cast a shadow. He's so lean. He's a very lean guy. And I'm an ultra distance runner in the just exceptional category. So what he did to prove this is he and a buddy of his, both type 1 endurance athletes, said, we are not going to eat anything, no calories. Now, he's literally skinny, although he's got adequate fat, he's got no visible fat. 0 calories for 5 days. And during that time, they're going to run 20 miles every day. And he looked at his insulin numbers, and his insulin requirement went way, way, way down. I think it was like 0.3 or 0.4 units. So he required very, very little insulin. He still required insulin. However, and he was running in ketosis, he did absolutely fine. Nothing happened. Nothing happened. He ran his races fine. He felt brilliant. And, you run 20 miles. The next day, you're lying with your legs up on the couch with ice packs. They ran this every day for 5 days. And it was just a brilliant experiment that he talks about. So, yes, there's variations to this, but he is a type 1 diabetic who can regulate his blood sugar with insulin. We can't. You and I cannot do that. We rely on our pancreas to do that, and we rely on gut hormones to trigger the pancreas to release that insulin. So I don't like the numbers, but I don't know if they mean anything biologically. And if you look at most of the cultures out there that we admire, that are primarily carnivore, the Maasai, milk is a part of their diet. So I'm raising that more as a question. It's stuff that I've seen in my practice. And when people do that over time, they tend to get a little bit better. I've coined the term insulin suppression as opposed to insulin resistance, because the insulin levels are suppressed because they don't need to be elevated. And my concern and my theoretical question is, what about the other functions of insulin? And I said, Paul Mason has talked about the same thing, but Paul has explained the elevation in A1C based on longevity and health of red cells, which is fine. That may be true, but I can't explain the triglycerides and the elevation in BUN. BUN, by the way, is our marker. BUN, creatinine, and uric acid are the 3 markers I use to determine adequacy of protein consumption. And if your BUN is super high, that means BUN is the way you break protein down. So why BUN? That measures nitrogen in the bloodstream. And if you look at carbohydrates and fat, they're made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. So we can breathe that out. Whereas protein is carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. And we can measure how much nitrogen is being released, but peed out, by measuring the BUN, blood urea nitrogen, that we pee out, to determine how much protein we're turning into sugar, which is the way we metabolize protein in the liver and even the muscle cells. Creatinine, creatine, and BUN and uric acid are the 3 waste protein, or are the 3 protein products. And if your BUN is substantially elevated on a carnivore diet, it means that your body is struggling to manage the overconsumption of that protein, because it's having to turn extra protein into energy, but it's a futile cycle. Because and that happens on people that are on a lean mass diet. So, by the way, Anthony, the first experiment we did when we saw this is we followed Naaman and Maria Emmerich's idea of protein sparing. Okay, so these guys are eating lean protein, because if it was true that elevated sugar triggers insulin release, then by eating excessive amounts of lean protein, getting that extra lean protein turned into sugar, which does happen, we can measure that, then we should see an equal response of insulin. And we didn't. The problem was that their blood sugars went through the roof and their insulin stayed low, and they were miserable. They were hungry all the time. They were miserable. You ask any carnivore that is on a lean protein diet, it sucks. Okay. So when we added the fat back, and they all did this automatically, that's where it was okay. So the point is, we proved with that experiment, human experiment, that lean protein and causing elevation of blood sugar does not cause a release of insulin. And for those folks, their BUNs were through the roof. And by the way, their cholesterols and their LDL went through the roof as well, because insulin regulates cholesterol production. So here's the paradox, is that if you are not regulating insulin, cholesterol production in the liver under the influence of insulin, you're in ketosis, which is a glucagon phenomenon, but insulin also blocks the absorption of cholesterol from the gut. So the lean mass hyperresponders, their high cholesterol is absorbed cholesterol because of a lack of insulin. And that's where Nick Norwitz, when he says, oh, eat Oreo cookies, and I've got Nick's blood work, I've worked with him for a long time. He's absolutely right. When you eat Oreo cookies, you bring those numbers down. Why? Because you're triggering insulin. And that blocks the absorption of fat, and your cholesterol and your LDL comes down. Yes, that's true. We do that in our carnivores using milk products. Again, if they want to stay carnivore, and just that little bit of galactose and glucose is adequate, not a huge amount to make carbohydrates a substrate, but enough to trigger GLP-1. But fat is so important as a substrate for energy in our carnivores. And we see some carnivores who are a little afraid of fat because their LDL, their cholesterol is high, and you're going to have a heart attack in about 10 minutes, even though your CAC score is 0, that they're afraid to eat adequate fat. And then we start to see these numbers go up as well. So I don't know what the right approach is. I'm a little worried about the numbers in these patients. They seem to do very well when they either add some carbohydrate or add some dairy products back into their diet. And again, dairy is probably the single most nutritious food we can eat. I mean, remember this, no mammal exists without dairy. So if some of my folks are underweight and they're trying to gain, some of our folks, our athletes, will use something like UCAN as starch. Zach Bitter uses that. There are a few other folks out there that will add some in. Our fear of carbohydrates, Isabella's paper has shown that we don't need to fear carbohydrates because these women all ate a little bit, but their blood work was pristine.